In the work you've completed so far, you should have already looked at the gastrointestinal tract and the structure and the function of all the various different parts of it. So now what I want to discuss is the accessory organs. The organs that are not directly part of that big long alimentary canal that runs from the mouth to the anus. They're not directly part of that, but they're organs that aid the digestive system and the processes that it goes through. So when we talk about the accessory organs of the digestive system, we're predominantly referring to the liver, the gallbladder and the pancreas. I'm very briefly going to mention salivary glands just now as well, but you'll cover them a lot more when you discuss oral biology. And at the end, we're also going to talk about the kidneys. Now, the kidneys are not technically part of the digestive system. They're actually part of the renal system and the urinary tract. However, they are involved in the excretion of waste, so that's why we've included it in this section on the digestive system. So let's first of all just look at the location of these. And what I'm using to do that is the biodigital human that I've referred to before, and I've suggested that you look at yourselves. You can just access this. You can see the web link there. It's a Google app, and you can log in for free using any Google account. So anybody can look at this. But if we look here, obviously we're looking at the head and the thorax and the abdomen of a human, in this case male, but either way. And what I've got here is the whole digestive system. But what we're predominantly focusing on is these organs. So I'm just going to take away the ribs so that you can see it a little bit better, because obviously a lot of this is in the thorax, so it's behind the rib cage. I just take away these. There we go. So if we look at it from the back, is probably the easiest way to think about it. Oh, that's the wrong one. The easiest way to think about the digestive tract, you can see it a little bit better from the back. You've got your esophagus running all the way down your stomach, and then moving into your small intestine and your colon, and then the anus and the rectum for secretion. But what we're thinking about mostly is these organs. So the most obvious that I'd hope you'd all be able to recognise without me being able to say much about it is obviously this big huge organ here, the liver. Then the pancreas and the gallbladder are tucked behind there. You can just about see them if we look from the bottom. There's little green bit here is the gallbladder and the pancreas is here. But if we turn them round again, you'll see it a lot better. The pancreas is this yellow area, and the gallbladder again is tucked up behind there. And then we have the kidneys on either side. So you've got two kidneys, one on either side. We'll come back to them later. Just whilst we're here, let's have a look at these salivary glands. So the salivary glands, as you might expect, obviously are located in the face. And if I take away the bones of the head, we'll be able to see these a bit better. So you've got three main salivary glands. You've got your parotid gland, your submandibular gland, and your sublingual gland. And if we turn them to the side, we can see these. The parotid being this big large gland here, submandibular, and then the sublingual. And the reason why we include them as accessory organs of the digestive system is without saliva produced by these glands, we wouldn't be able to even initiate the process of swallowing. If you've ever suffered from a very dry mouth or come across perhaps patients or relatives or whatever who've suffered from a dry mouth, swallowing is incredibly difficult. And that's because you haven't got the lubrication for the food to move down there. Unless you're eating something that's very liquidy in the first place, that's difficult. Also, saliva contains enzymes, in particular salivary amylase, which very loosely starts the digestive process, the chemical digestive process. So they are involved with the digestive system, but I don't really feel we need to go into a lot more at this point because, like I said, it is going to be covered when we talk about oral biology. So let's move on to the main bulk of these organs then. And the liver is by far the biggest one that we're going to talk about. In fact, if you discount the skin, the liver is the largest of all human organs. and it traverses the abdominal cavity. So it has, the bulk is on the right hand side of the body, and then it tapers towards the left. It's inferior to the diaphragm, so beneath the diaphragm. It's surrounded by a connective tissue capsule, like all organs, in order to protect it. And the liver is absolutely essential to life. You'll have heard of people who perhaps need liver transplants or whatever, and that's because you absolutely cannot live without your liver. And whilst we have discovered means of coping with other organs, such as dialysis for kidneys, we have no artificial substitute for the liver, so we need it. We can cope with quite a small amount of it left, but we absolutely need it. It's split into 4 lobes, and looking at it from the front, which is the smaller picture here, the bulk of it is the right lobe. It's the largest part of it. And then on the left-hand side of the anterior, so from the front, we've also got the left lobe. But then behind the back of the liver, which is what this picture at the bottom is, so looking from the posterior surface, you've also got 2 more that we call the caudate lobe and the quadrate lobe. So the caudate lobe is this area down the bottom, which is around the inferior vena cava, so the main vein that comes up from our lower body to the heart. And then the quadrate lobe is above that, and it's wrapped around the gallbladder. There's a number of different cells within the liver that perform the different liver functions. The main ones we want to talk about here are Kupffer cells and the hepatocytes. The Kupffer cells are white blood cells. They're actually macrophages, and they're there to remove waste, and in particular remove old cells that are no longer functional. So old red blood cells that are being broken down, in order for the body to utilise the remnants of those cells, so to utilise the hemoglobin and the iron, the Kupffer cells, the macrophages within the liver, can gather up that waste, get rid of what we don't need, and take what we do need where it can be reutilised. And then the hepatocytes are the functional cells of the liver. Hepat is the prefix we use to refer to the liver. So hepatocytes are the cells that perform the liver function. They're cuboidal cells, and they are secretory cells, so therefore they're epithelial cells. So if you go back to when we talked about different tissue types, and we said that organs were a collection of lots of different tissue types, and that epithelial cells were found within glandular tissue, and that's what these hepatocytes are. They're forming the glandular tissue of the liver that produces the various different things that it produces. The circulation of the liver is very important. We refer to this as the portal circulation. All the blood of the body passes through the portal circulation, and therefore the liver at some point. The liver is vital in terms of utilising the nutrients that the body gathers from the digestive system, hence why we're talking about it here. So therefore, the vast majority of the blood that comes through the liver comes directly from the digestive system. And that comes there via the hepatic portal vein. So if it's venous blood, it means it's deoxygenated blood. So it's got very little oxygen because it's already supplied the digestive system area with oxygen. However, it is rich in nutrients because the blood has received the nutrients from the digestive system. So it can go to the liver with all its nutrients, and the liver can process and do its thing with those. So that's about 75% of the supply of blood to the liver. However, the liver also needs oxygen in order for the hepatocytes and the Kupffer cells to function. So 25% of the blood, the other 25% that's not coming from the hepatic portal vein, comes from the hepatic arteries. So that has come straight from the heart. It actually branches off the aorta in the abdomen. So that blood is really, really rich in oxygen. However, it's got very little nutrients. So 25% of the blood to the liver comes via the hepatic arteries, and the rest the hepatic portal vein. And between those two, That's all the blood of the body at some point, and the liver is able to receive the nutrition it needs as well as process everything else in the digestive system so that it's usable for the rest of the body. So to think then about actually what the liver does, now we know where it is and what it looks like and where the blood's coming from. It's got four main roles. And probably the most important one of them is what I'm referring to with this picture here is metabolism. And this is what the hepatocytes do. So by the time the blood gets to the hepatic portal vein, it's really, really rich in glucose because most of the larger components such as carbohydrates, fats have already been broken down in the digestive system. So by the time it gets into the bloodstream, it's there as glucose. There will be remaining other parts, however, that haven't quite broken down, and the hepatocytes will function to do that. They take the larger carbohydrates, the lipids and the proteins and break any of those remaining parts down into smaller functional units that the body can use. Without the liver, we would be left with these larger molecules and the body wouldn't be able to utilise them at a cellular level. The second really important function of the liver is storage. We don't necessarily need all the nutrition that we get from our food at the time when we receive it. We need somewhere where we can store it for a time when we need it. So for example, you can have a large meal and then go straight to bed. You might feel a little bit uncomfortable, but you could just go straight to bed. You don't want to just lose all that nutrition. So in the liver, we're able to store large quantities of glucose, and it's stored as a product called glycogen. And then in times of great need, so in times of exercise or stress or poor intake, we can utilise all this glucagon and return it to glucose for the body to use. This image here is referring to immunity, and that's because there are immune cells within the liver, the Kupffer cells that we've already mentioned, and the macrophages. And because so much blood passes through the liver, in fact, all the blood passes through the liver at some point, but at any one point of time, there's a huge quantity of blood in the liver, it's a really good place for these Kupffer cells to be able to screen the blood and remove anything that shouldn't be there, to remove any non-self items. And lastly, this picture up here is the only thing I could find, I'm afraid, to refer to bile. Bile is we're going to come on to talk about in just a second. Bile is produced by the liver and stored elsewhere in the gallbladder. Bile is an essential addition that we need into our digestive system for it to function properly, and bile is produced in the liver. So we're going to move on to the gallbladder, because the gallbladder is where the bile is stored. So although the liver can store glucose and other nutrients, it doesn't store the bile itself, it moves on to the gallbladder. And I'm going to move back to our image here so that we can just have a quick look at where the gallbladder is. I'm going to just remove some of these other items so that we can properly see the gallbladder. And if we turn them round, doesn't want to turn round. There we go. I'm going to zoom in a little. So, big, huge liver covering the entirety of the abdomen, and the gallbladder is tucked in behind between the liver and the pancreas. And you'll see it's got a long tube or duct that connects it to the liver. And that's because the liver has produced the bile that will then be stored in the gallbladder. The bile produced by the liver travels from the liver, which is up in this region, down through the hepatic duct. and it's travelling down towards what will eventually be the small intestine. However, if it's not required at that moment in time, it sort of does a little U-turn and goes back up the cystic duct and hangs out in the gallbladder for a while. And the gallbladder is a muscular organ, so it's basically a sac of muscular tissue. And when bile is required, the gallbladder squeezes and the bile goes back down the cystic duct and through the bile duct, the common bile duct, into the duodenum of the small intestine. And bile is really vital in terms of our digestive system. It's added to the contents of our GI tract in the duodenum via the ampulle of Vater. The ampulle of Vater is the opening towards the top of the duodenum where the contents of the gallbladder and the pancreas are added to the contents of the small intestine, which is referred to as chyme at that stage. Now, it is mostly water, it is a fluid substance, and the water is important in terms of hydration of the contents. If you've eaten something particularly dry, that won't move well through the system, obviously, so water is there to lubricate. It also contains bile salts, and the bile salts are really important at emulsifying. So what we mean by that is, when you're dealing with fats, they're not water soluble. You'll know this yourself if you've been cooking, and say you've had a frying pan and it's had cooking oil in it, and then you put it in a sink of water. The oil all sits on the surface because it doesn't dissolve into the water. What we need to happen in order for the fats to be absorbed through the walls of the small intestine is for them to be broken down into much smaller units. And that's what emulsifiers do. And the bile salts take this big slick of fatty tissue and break it down into small droplets so then it can be processed through the villi and into the lymphatic system in order for it to be used throughout the body. And the last thing you find in bile is actually waste products from the liver. So as the liver cells, the hepatocytes, have performed their functions, and also the Kupffer cells, you're left with waste products that we don't want. And because the bile eventually ends up in the digestive system, in the GI tract, it will eventually be excreted when it's done its job. So therefore, it's quite a good way of the liver getting rid of its waste products. So any excess cholesterol that we don't require will exit through bile, and also bilirubin. And bilirubin is the product of breakdown of hemoglobin. So we've had excess, we don't need it anymore. And it's a bright green colour. That's what gives bile its green colour, and really unpleasant acidity. That's come from the bilirubin, the waste product. And it's also what eventually actually colours our faeces as it breaks down further throughout the digestive system, turns to that sort of brown colour. So bile is produced in the liver, it's then stored in the gallbladder and excreted into the duodenum via the ampulla of Vater when it's required. So I mentioned the other thing that happens is at the ampulla of Vater is that the pancreatic secretions are released. And the pancreatic secretions are vital in the breakdown of the contents of the digestive system. From your reading, you'll already have found out that in the stomach, gastric juices are added, which contain acid and some enzymes to break things down. But this goes on much more in the small intestine, and that's because of the additions that the pancreas adds to the contents of it. The pancreas is found running again transverse across the abdomen. If we go back to here, we'll see it quite nicely behind here. So it's considerably smaller than the liver, and it sits below the liver and towards the back of it as well. But it is quite a lot bigger than the gallbladder, but much smaller than the liver. It's what we call a heterocrine gland. It contains both exocrine and endocrine cells. You're going to talk about the endocrine system quite shortly. The difference between endocrine and exocrine glands is the endocrine glandular tissue produces substances that travel then via a duct or a tube to where they need to be used. So it's the classic example of that is the pancreatic juices that the pancreas creates travel along through the duct and enter via the ampulla levator into the duodenum. However, you also get endocrine glands, and endocrine glands produce hormones. And they're not released into a specific area via a duct. They're actually released directly into the bloodstream that will then transport them to where they need to be used. So the pancreas creates both of those things. It has exocrine for the digestive juices and endocrine hormones in the form of insulin, which is a hormone that's used to regulate sugar levels. And we're going to focus just now on its exocrine functions in terms of its pancreatic juices, and later when you talk about the endocrine system, you'll talk about insulin and the hormones that the pancreas produces. So it's quite a sort of soft, lumpy type organ because it's all glandular tissue. You can see from this diagram, it's that sort of lumpy lobular texture. And the secretions it produces, again, are largely water because it helps with lubrication, and salts to help with breakdown. Bicarbonates are really important at this point because bicarbonate will neutralize the acids, and as the chyme enters the duodenum from the stomach, it's obviously really acidic because of all the acid the stomach added, but that acid won't do the small intestine or the large intestine for that matter any good. So at this point, bicarbonates are added in pancreatic juices to neutralize it again. And then a huge number of enzymes are added. Amylase to break down protein, lipase to help break down fat, and loads of others, which it's not particularly important for you to know the specific names, but it is important that you understand what the enzymes are doing. So what we're looking at here is an example of starch being broken down into sugar molecules or glucose. Now basically you've got long chains, lots of sugar molecules that are all linked together, and then an enzyme will come along and basically break down these bonds between the big long chains, and you're left with the smaller molecules that can be processed then through the intestinal walls and onto the liver to be used and processed for the rest of the body. So the pancreatic juices are there to complete the chemical digestion process. Mechanical digestion has gone on before that in terms of chewing, peristalsis, and the churning in the stomach. Once we get into the small intestine, things are already broken down physically to the smallest they can be, but we need the pancreatic juices in combination with the bile to help break them down to their smallest possible size. So you can see now how the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas all work together to complete the digestive process that will go on in the small intestine.